Check this out, Base Hammer here, bringing you another Commander deck tech, and today we are looking at Tevel, the Balanced Scale. This is kind of like a Sultai, Delirium, Landfall, Graveyard type strategy, so we're going to want to put as many cards into our graveyard as possible. That way we can utilize our graveyard to deal with all of our opponent's stuff and basically take over the entire game utilizing lands from our graveyard, big creatures. Tevel himself, anytime he attacks, we mill 3 cards, then we can return any land from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and whenever one or more cards leave our graveyard, we get to create a 2/2 black zombie. So, let's get right into this. These first creatures are ones that are going to help us put as many cards into our graveyard as possible. So, we're going to utilize the dredge mechanic. Dredge is a replacement effect. If you would draw a card, you mill however many the dredge is. In this case, with Golgari Thug, he has dredge 4. So anytime we would draw a card, we're going to mill 4 cards. Whenever Golgari Thug would be put into a graveyard, we get to put any creature card from our graveyard back on top of our library. Now we have Stinkweed Imp. Whenever this creature blocks, it'll deal damage to that creature. We get to destroy that creature, and has dredge 5. Now we have Stitcher Supplier. When he's put into a graveyard, we get to mill 3 cards. Now we have Satyr Wayfinder. When this enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library and put any land from among them into our hand, and the rest are put into our graveyard. Now we have Colossal Grave Reaver. This is a very large creature. When he enters the battlefield or attacks, we get to mill 3 cards. So not only are we putting more cards into our graveyard, we're putting potentially very large, scary creatures on the battlefield at the same time. Now we have my personal favorite. We have Shigeki, Jukai Visionary. He has a couple different effects. More importantly, he has a channel ability. So for 2 green and then double X, X is however much mana you pay into this, you can discard it and return any non-legendary cards from your graveyard back to your hand. He has a really good activated ability. For a colorless and a green, you can return Shigeki back to your hand. Then you reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and then you can put a land card from among those on the battlefield tapped, and the rest are put into your graveyard. Now we have Lotus Light Dancers. This is a 3/6 with lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, we have to search our library for a black card, a green card, and a blue card. So this is going to be a good way to constantly recur this back to the battlefield so you can keep tutoring colored spells. Now we have 6. This is a 2/4 with reach. Whenever 6 attacks, we mill 3 cards, and we can put a land card from among them into our hand. And as long as it's our turn, non-land permanents in our graveyard have retrace. So retrace is a additional cost to casting spells from your graveyard just by discarding lands. Okay, now we have some creatures that are going to allow us to play multiple lands in a turn and synergize with lands entering the battlefield or going to the graveyard or being played from the graveyard. Of course, we have Secure Tri-Builder. We can sacrifice this to search our library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now we have Oracle of Moldiah. This will allow us to play additional lands on each of our turns. We do have to play with the top card of our library revealed, and if that top card is a land, we can play it from the top of our library. Now we have Azusa Lost But Seeking. We can play 2 additional lands each turn. Now we have Ice Till Explorer. We can play an additional land on each of our turns. We can also play lands from our graveyard, and has Landfall. So anytime a land enters the battlefield, we get to mill a card. Of course, we have the Gitrog monster. The Gitrog monster is going to synergize so well with all these lands entering the battlefield and going to the graveyard. Besides being a 6/6 with Death Touch, every single upkeep we would have to sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless we sacrifice a land. But he will allow us to play an additional land on each of our turns. And then whenever 1 or more lands are put into a graveyard from anywhere, we get to draw a card. Now we have Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. If it enters the battlefield, we'll have to sacrifice it unless it was escaped. Escape is just an alternate casting cost. So for 2 green and 2 blue, we have to exile 5 other cards from our graveyard in order to cast this from our graveyard. When Uro enters the battlefield or attacks, we can gain 3 life, draw a card, and then put a land from our hand on the battlefield. Now we have Vorinclex. This is a 6/6 with trample and reach, and anytime it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for 2 forest cards and put those into our hand. He also has a really cool activated ability. So for 6 generic and 2 green, we can exile Vorinclex and then return it back to the battlefield transformed, and it'll transform into a saga. So chapter 1, we mill 10 cards, then we can put up to 2 target creature cards from among those that was milled on the battlefield. When we get to chapter 2, we can distribute 7+1 counters among any number of creatures we control. And then chapter 3, until end of turn, all our creatures gain pay 1 generic. This creature fights another creature we don't control, and then we exile the Grand Evolution, return back to the battlefield. So once that last chapter triggers, it'll go back to being Vorinclex the creature. Now we have Troll of Khazad-dûm. This has swamp cycling, so for 1 generic mana, we can discard this card and search our library for a swamp card and put that into our hand. It's also a very large creature, so we're going to want to discard this early. That way we can bring it back at a later time. Similar to that, we have Generous Ent. This has forest cycling, so we can discard this and go search for a forest card and put that into our hand. Whenever Generous Ent enters the battlefield, we get to create a food token. Now we have some creatures that are going to synergize with lands enter the battlefield. So, of course, we have Scoot Swarm. Anytime a land enters the battlefield, we're going to create a 1/1 green insect token. And then if we control 6 or more lands, which isn't going to be hard to do, we're going to create an exact copy of Scoot Swarm. Of course, we have Tireless Provisioner. Anytime a land enters the battlefield, under our control, we can create a food token or a treasure token. Of course, we have Avenger of Zendikar. When this enters the battlefield, we get an 0/1 green plant token for every single land we control, and then anytime a land enters the battlefield, we get to put a +1 counter on each plant we control. Now we have some creatures that are going to synergize with basically everything we're doing and other ways to draw cards or return things from our graveyard. So we have Muldrifter. This has Evoke, so we can pay its alternate evoke cost for 2 colorless and a blue. It'll enter the battlefield and then trigger, then we have to sacrifice it. When it enters the battlefield, we can draw 2 cards. And in case we need to get back any card from our graveyard, we have Eternal Witness. When it enters the battlefield, we can return any card. Now we have Greensleeves, Morrow's Sorcerer. So its power and toughness are equal to the total number of lands we control. Anytime a land enters the battlefield, we get to create a 3/3 green Badger token. Now we have my personal favorite with Muldrotha of the Gravetide. During each of our turns, we can play 1 permanent type from our graveyard. Now we have Multani, Yavamaya's avatar. Its power and toughness will be equal to the total number of lands we control on the battlefield and in our graveyard. It also has reach and trample, so it blocks really well, and we can pay a colorless and a green. We can return 2 lands we control back to our hand and return this from our graveyard back to our hand. Now we have Keru Goldkeeper. And whenever 1 or more cards leave our graveyard during our turn, we get to create a treasure token. This also has Renew. So for 2 colorless and Sultai, we can exile this card from our graveyard and put 2 +1 counters and a flying counter on target creature. Now we have River Kelpie. Whenever this creature or another permanent enters the battlefield from a graveyard, we get to draw a card. And then whenever a player casts a spell from our graveyard, we get to draw a card. Now we have Bonnie Paul, Clear Cutter. This is a 6/5 with reach, and whenever Bonnie Paul enters the battlefield, we get to create Bow, a legendary blue ox token, where its power and toughness are equal to the total number of lands we control, and then anytime we attack, we get to draw a card, then put a land from our graveyard or from our hand on the battlefield. Of course, a graveyard deck would not be complete without Sheoldred Whispering One. This is a 6/6 with Swamp Walk. Every single upkeep, we get to return any creature from any graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they have to sacrifice a creature. Now we have some creatures that are going to deal with all of our opponent's stuff. And my personal favorite is Dauthi Voidwalker. This is a 3/2 with Shadow, so it can only block or be blocked by creatures that have this ability. If any card would be put into a opponent's graveyard from anywhere, it gets exiled with a void counter on it, and we can activate Dauthi Voidwalker, sacrifice it, and we can cast one of those cards that had a void counter on it without paying its mana cost. Of course, we have Koma, Cosmos Serpent. Can't be countered. Every single upkeep, we get to create a 3/3 blue serpent token named Koma's Coil, and we can sacrifice any serpent, and we can either tap down a permanent, and its activated abilities cannot be activated. By sacrificing a serpent, Koma becomes indestructible. Now we have Jared, Golgari Lichlord. It'll get +1/+1 for each creature in our graveyard, and we can pay a colorless, a black, and a green to sacrifice another creature, and each opponent will lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. We can sacrifice a swamp and a forest to return Jared from our graveyard back to our hand. And if our opponents have a lot of creatures, we have Massacre Worm. When it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2, and has a static effect. Whenever any creature a opponent controls is put into a graveyard, that player loses 2 life. Of course, we have Deathrite Shaman. It has 3 different activated abilities. You can activate it to exile a land from any graveyard to add 1 mana of any color, or you can pay a black, exile a instant or sorcery, then each opponent will lose 2 life. You can pay a green to exile a creature card to gain 2 life. Of course, we have Sir Conrad the Grim. Whenever any creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, whether it be discarded or milled, or a creature card leaves our graveyard, it'll deal 1 damage to each opponent. And if we need to, we can pay a colorless and a black, then each player will mill a card. Of course, we have Ob Nixilis the Fallen. This is Landfall, so anytime a land enters the battlefield, you can have target player lose 3 life, and then we put 3/+1 counters on Ob Nixilis. Of course, we have Haywire Might. When it is put into a graveyard, we get to gain 2 life, but we can pay 1 green to sacrifice it to exile a non-creature artifact or a non-creature enchantment. Of course, we have Reclamation Sage. When it enters the battlefield, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now we have Noxious Gearhulk. This is a 5/4 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, we get to destroy target creature, and then we gain life equal to the destroyed creature's toughness. Now we have Amphin Mutineer. When this enters the battlefield, we get to exile a target non-salamander creature, and then its controller creates a 4/3 salamander token. This also has Encore, so we can pay 4 generic and 2 blue. We can exile this from our graveyard, and then for each opponent, we're going to create a token copy that's attacking that opponent. Now we have Accursed Marauder. When this enters the battlefield, each player will sacrifice a non-token creature. Now we have Platecrafter. When this enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and if they can't, they have to discard. Of course, we have Toxrill the Corrosive. This is a pretty good commander just on his own. Every single end step, we get to put a slime counter on each creature we do not control. And creatures we don't control will get -1/-1 for each slime counter on it. And then whenever a creature we don't control with a slime counter on it is put into a graveyard, we get to create a 1/1 black slug token. And then we can pay a blue and a black to sacrifice a slug to draw a card. Okay, let's get into the instants. There's only 2. They are Counterspell and Arcane Denial. Because this is a very permanent base deck, we're not going to run that many instants or sorceries. Okay, let's get into the sorceries. Most of these are just going to be ways to put stuff into our graveyard or get them out of our graveyard. Of course, we have Life from the Loam. When we cast this, we can return 3 lands from our graveyard back to our hand, and also has Dredge 3. Now we have Buried Alive. We're going to search our library for 3 creature cards and put them directly into our graveyard. And probably the best way to deal with it is Windfall. Each player will discard their hand and then we draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards that were discarded. Now we need ways to get all these things from our graveyard back to the battlefield. And probably the best one is reanimate. We can put any creature card from any graveyard on the battlefield under our control. Then we lose life equal to that creature's mana cost. Now we have victimize. We're going to choose 2 target creatures in our graveyard. We sacrifice a creature. Then we return the 2 chosen cards back to the battlefield tapped. Now we have dread return. We can return target creature from our graveyard back to the battlefield. This also has flashback. So we sacrifice 3 creatures to cast this again. Of course, we have living death. This one's really fun. So if we put a whole bunch of creatures into our graveyard, when we cast this, we're going to exile all creatures from our graveyard, and then every creature that's on the battlefield currently gets sacrificed, and then we return all the creatures that were in our graveyard to the battlefield. Okay, let's get into the artifacts. Of course, we have Soul Ring, our Arcane Signet. Now we got a fun one. We have Crucible of Worlds. This is going to allow us to play lands from our graveyard. Now we have Conduit of Ruin. This will also allow us to play lands from our graveyard, but has a really cool activated ability. We can choose a non-land permanent that's in our graveyard. If we have not cast a spell that turn, we can cast that from our graveyard. Now we have Head Shredder. This is a vehicle, so it's not a creature until we crew it. So for the power of 1, we can turn this into a creature. And then whenever Head Shredder attacks, we mill 2 cards. And then whenever 1 or more lands are put into our graveyard from our library, we can put it straight on the battlefield tapped. Okay, let's get into the enchantments. There's only 4. So we have Exploration. This will allow us to play additional lands on each of our turns. The whole reason we want to play as many lands per turn is because we're going to have a lot of utility lands that are going to synergize with everything. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Now we have Animate Dead. This will allow us to put any creature from any graveyard on the battlefield under our control. Now we have Tevil's Judgment. Whenever 1 or more cards leave our graveyard, we can choose one that hasn't been chosen. We could draw a card, which will trigger Dredge as well. We can create a treasure token in case we need the mana. Or we create a 2/2 black zombie. Now we have Greater Good. We can sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. This is going to keep that engine going. That way we can keep drawing cards and keep putting stuff on the battlefield. Okay, let's get into the land base. This is a very fun land base. We have our command tower, our Zygo Triome. If we don't need this, we can pay 3, discard it, and draw a card. If we need to trigger Dredge. Of course, we have Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs, Foreboding Landscape. This has cycling as well, but it'll allow us to search for either a swamp, a forest, or an island. Now we have Fable Passage as our fetch lands to go get the lands that we really need. So we can go get Breeding Pool, Watery Grave, Overgrown Tomb. Now we have a Surveil land. We have Undercity Sewers. We didn't go crazy with all these Surveil lands. One's plenty. When it enters the battlefield, we get to Surveil. We get to look at the top card. We can either leave that card on top or put that into our graveyard. Now we have our Battlebond lands. So we have Undergrowth Stadium, Rejuvenating Springs, and Dreamroot Cascade. And we have our check lands. So we have Woodland Cemetery, Drowned Catacomb, and Hinterland Harbor. Now we have a filter land. So we have Flooded Grove. And probably the best one is Cephalid Coliseum. This is going to do the best job at putting the most amount of cards in our graveyard, assuming we have a dredger like Stinkweed Imp or Golgari Thug. We're going to pay a blue, sacrifice Cephalid Coliseum. We're going to draw 3 cards, then discard 3. So by drawing 3, we're going to trigger Dredge, and then we're going to discard the 3 dredgers. That way we can put the most amount of cards into our graveyard. And in case we need to deal with our opponent's graveyard, we have Bojuka Bog. When this enters, we can exile the entire graveyard. And if our opponents have certain lands we don't like, we can just blow them up with strip mine. Strip mine every single turn with additional land drops, blowing up your opponent's entire land base is kind of mean, but sometimes that's just how those games go. Now we have Drowned Yard Temple. We can pay 3, return Drowned Yard Temple from our graveyard back to the battlefield tapped. In case we need to sacrifice a land every single turn, we can just keep sacrificing Drowned Yard Temple and getting it back. We have 6 swamps, 7 forests, and 4 islands. And that was the Commander Deck Tech for Tevel the Balanced Scale. I really hope you guys enjoyed this Sultai Landfall Graveyard build. This deck's really fun. I've always really loved graveyard type strategies because they play a different game that your opponents really can't interact with too much, and it's just a lot of fun. But let me know in the comments below if you guys really love graveyard type strategies or if you guys have any more suggestions for this particular build. I'll leave the link to the Moxville deck list, like always, in the comments below. I'm really trying to put these comprehensive deck techs out there for the entire Magic community to enjoy. Until next time, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share these videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.